The dawn of civilization marks a transformative period in human history, often referred to as the Neolithic Revolution. This era, beginning around 10,000 BCE, was characterized by a monumental shift from a nomadic, hunter-gatherer lifestyle to settled agricultural societies. Before this change, early humans relied on hunting animals and gathering wild plants for survival, living in small, mobile groups that followed the availability of resources. While this lifestyle had sustained humanity for thousands of years, it limited population growth and societal complexity. The Neolithic Revolution began with the domestication of plants and animals, a process that unfolded independently in several regions of the world, including the Fertile Crescent, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, and Sub-Saharan Africa. Early farmers cultivated staple crops like wheat, barley, rice, and maize, while domesticating animals such as sheep, goats, and cattle for food, labor, and other resources. This shift to agriculture provided a more stable and predictable food supply, allowing communities to grow in size and establish permanent settlements. With the advent of farming, early humans began constructing more durable shelters and developing tools tailored to agriculture, such as plows and irrigation systems. Villages like Jericho in the Levant and Catalhoyuk in Anatolia are among the earliest examples of organized settlements, showcasing the initial stages of urbanization. These settlements also introduce concepts of property ownership and resource management, laying the groundwork for economic systems. The surplus of food generated by agriculture had profound social implications. For the first time, not everyone needed to be directly involved in food production. This allowed some individuals to specialize in other activities, such as crafting, trade, and governance. Specialization gave rise to a more complex division of labor and the emergence of social hierarchies. Leaders and elites often controlled resources, while others took on roles as artisans, merchants, or religious figures. The development of writing systems was another critical outcome of this era. As societies grew, the need to record transactions, manage resources, and document events became essential. Early forms of writing, such as cuneiform in Mesopotamia and hieroglyphs in Egypt, initially focused on administrative tasks but eventually evolved to encompass literature, laws, and religious texts. Moreover, the establishment of settled communities fostered the growth of culture and religion. Shared beliefs and rituals helped to unite people, giving rise to temples, communal ceremonies, and artistic expressions. Monumental architecture, such as ziggurats in Mesopotamia and megalithic structures like Stonehenge, reflected these burgeoning spiritual and cultural practices. However, the transition to agricultural societies also brought challenges. With settled life came the spread of diseases, as larger populations living in close proximity to one another and their domesticated animals created new environments for pathogens. Additionally, reliance on specific crops made communities vulnerable to famine in the event of crop failure. Social stratification often led to inequalities and conflicts over resources. Despite these challenges, the dawn of civilization remains one of the most significant turning points in human history. It marked the beginning of humanity's journey toward building complex societies, creating technologies, and establishing cultural legacies that continue to influence the world today. This era set the stage for the development of cities, states, and eventually the vast empires that would define the ancient world. The Age of Empires was a defining period in human history, spanning thousands of years, during which societies expanded their influence, consolidated power, and created some of the most enduring legacies of governance, culture, and infrastructure. Empires were born from the ambition to unify disparate regions under a central authority, often through military conquest, diplomacy, and trade. This era began in ancient times and continued well into the early modern period, leaving a profound impact on the political, social, and cultural structures of the world. One of the earliest empires to emerge was the Akkadian Empire, circa 2334 BCE, in Mesopotamia, under the rule of Sargon the Great. This empire is often regarded as the first to unite city-states under a single ruler, setting the precedent for centralized governance. The Akkadians established a system of administration and record-keeping that became a model for future empires. Similarly, The Egyptian Old Kingdom, with its iconic pyramids, showcased an early form of centralized authority rooted in religious and political cohesion. The Age of Empires saw the rise of some of history's most famous civilizations, including the Greeks, Romans, Persians, and Chinese dynasties. The Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great and Darius I exemplified a model of governance that balanced conquest with cultural tolerance. The empire's vast network of roads, including the Royal Road, facilitated trade, communication, and the movement of armies, connecting regions from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean. The Greek city-states, particularly Athens and Sparta, left an indelible mark on the world through their intellectual and cultural achievements. Athens pioneered democracy, where citizens participated directly in decision-making, an idea that influenced political systems for centuries. The conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE created one of the largest empires of the ancient world and facilitated the spread of Greek culture, language, and knowledge across Asia, Africa, and Europe, an era known as the Hellenistic period. The Roman Empire, lasting over a millennium if one includes the Byzantine continuation, became a cornerstone of Western civilization. Its legal framework, including principles of justice and citizenship, remains foundational to many modern legal systems. Rome's architectural feats, such as aqueducts, amphitheaters, and roads, demonstrated the engineering prowess that supported its vast territories. At its height, the empire spanned from Britain to North Africa and the Middle East, uniting diverse cultures under a common administrative system. In the East, the Chinese dynasties, such as the Han and Tang, showcased another facet of imperial governance. The Han dynasty, 206 BC, 220 CE, established a bureaucratic system based on Confucian principles, emphasizing meritocracy and governance by educated officials. The Silk Road, facilitated by the stability provided by these empires, became a crucial trade network that not only transported goods like silk and spices but also ideas, religions, and technologies across continents. Empires also shaped the cultures and traditions of the regions they governed. The blending of indigenous traditions with those of the ruling power often resulted in vibrant cultural syncretism. For instance, the Maurya Empire in India, under Emperor Ashoka, promoted Buddhism while maintaining respect for local traditions, spreading Buddhist principles as far as Southeast Asia. Despite their achievements, empires were often built on conquest and subjugation, leading to cycles of resistance and rebellion. The Roman Empire faced challenges from external invaders like the Goths and internal conflicts that led to its eventual decline. Similarly, the Persian Empire fell to the Macedonians under Alexander the Great, and later empires would face similar fates as rival powers emerged. The Age of Empires represents a critical chapter in human history, marked by innovation, expansion, and cultural exchange. Empires fostered connections between distant regions, setting the stage for the globalized world we know today. They were both architects of progress and witnesses to the consequences of ambition and power. Religious and philosophical movements have been central to shaping human societies, providing frameworks for ethical behavior, governance, and personal meaning. Between 500 BCE and 500 CE, a profound shift in human thought gave birth to the world's major religions and enduring philosophical traditions, many of which continue to influence the course of history today. These movements often arose in response to the challenges of life, the search for wisdom, and the desire to explain the mysteries of the universe. While each movement was unique, many shared a focus on the moral conduct of individuals and the ideal organization of society, aiming to offer guidance on how to live harmoniously with others and the divine. The origins of some of the most influential religions of the world can be traced to this period, each of which sought to provide answers to fundamental questions about existence, suffering, and the nature of the divine. In India, around the 6th century BCE, Siddhartha Gautama, later known as the Buddha, introduced Buddhism. Rejecting the rigid caste system and the material world's distractions, Buddhism emphasized personal enlightenment through practices such as meditation, mindfulness, and the Eightfold Path. The core principle of Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths, highlighted the nature of suffering, dukkha, its causes, and the path to its cessation, which became the foundation for a spiritual revolution that spread across Asia. Parallel to the rise of Buddhism, Hinduism, already a centuries-old tradition, continued to evolve. The Upanishads, part of Hindu scripture, introduced profound philosophical ideas about the nature of the self, Atman, and the ultimate reality, Brahman. Hinduism explored complex notions of karma, dharma, duty, and moksha, liberation, and the idea of reincarnation formed a critical element of the Hindu worldview. These concepts of cyclical existence, moral responsibility, and spiritual liberation had a profound influence not just within India but across Southeast Asia as well. In the West, during the same period, another major religious and philosophical tradition emerged. Around 600 BCE, the Hebrew prophets began articulating ideas of monotheism, which were revolutionary for their time. The belief in one, all-powerful God, who created the world and demanded moral behavior, laid the foundation for Judaism. This new religious paradigm emphasized justice, mercy, and the importance of following divine commandments. As it evolved, Judaism influenced Christianity and Islam, two other monotheistic religions that would emerge in subsequent centuries. At the same time, philosophical movements emerged in ancient Greece, where thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle sought to understand the nature of the universe, ethics, and the ideal society. Socrates, known for his method of questioning, encouraged individuals to seek wisdom through self-examination, famously stating, "The unexamined life is not worth living." His student Plato founded the academy and posited that the physical world was merely a shadow of a higher, ideal realm of forms. Plato's writings on politics, particularly in The Republic, introduced ideas about justice, the role of the philosopher king, and the nature of the soul. Aristotle, another giant of Greek philosophy, made lasting contributions to logic, ethics, and science, offering ideas about virtue, the pursuit of happiness, and the concept of the golden mean. While Greek philosophers focused on reason, in China, Confucius and Laozi developed systems that combine philosophy with ethics, religion, and governance. Confucianism emphasized the importance of moral conduct, family loyalty, and respect for authority. Confucius's teachings, centered around the 5 relationships and the concept of run, benevolence or humaneness, had a profound influence on Chinese society, shaping its education system and civil service for centuries. His ideas also influenced other East Asian cultures, creating a common thread that linked societies in China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. In contrast, Laozi's philosophy of Taoism, focused on harmony with the natural world, the pursuit of simplicity, and the idea of the Tao, Wei, an ineffable force that flows through all life. Taoism encouraged individuals to align themselves with the natural order, embrace spontaneity, and avoid the constraints of excessive human intervention and ambition. While Confucianism emphasized social order and moral duties, Taoism offered an alternative path that emphasized inner peace and balance with the universe. During the same period, another critical religious movement arose in the form of Zoroastrianism, the state religion of the Persian Empire. Founded by the prophet Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, Zoroastrianism introduced the concept of a single, all-powerful deity, Ahura Mazda, who was in an eternal struggle with Ungra Mainyu, the spirit of evil. Zoroastrianism's dualistic worldview, with its emphasis on personal responsibility and the eventual triumph of good over evil, had a significant influence on later monotheistic religions, including Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The period also saw the evolution of the ethical teachings within these religions. In Christianity, Jesus of Nazareth became the central figure, preaching about love, compassion, and salvation. His teachings, recorded by his disciples, became the foundation of Christian doctrine, emphasizing forgiveness, charity, and the kingdom of God. Christianity's growth from a small Jewish sect to a major world religion was greatly influenced by the work of Paul the Apostle, who spread the message of Christ throughout the Roman Empire. Philosophical and religious movements were not merely about individual belief systems. They often provided the social glue for societies, offering a sense of shared values and purpose. These movements addressed not only spiritual concerns, but also practical questions about the nature of governance, justice, and human interaction. The religious texts, philosophical writings, and ethical teachings that emerged from these movements became the bedrock of laws, cultural practices, and societal norms in various regions, influencing everything from politics to art, education, and social structures. In conclusion, the period between 500 BCE and 500 CE was marked by profound intellectual, spiritual, and ethical developments that fundamentally reshaped humanity's understanding of existence and morality. The religious and philosophical movements of this era provided frameworks that continue to influence billions of people across the world today. These movements were not isolated. They spread through trade, conquest, and intellectual exchange, creating a rich tapestry of beliefs and practices that shaped the course of history and laid the foundation for modern civilizations. The Middle Ages, often defined as the period from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE to the beginning of the Renaissance around the 14th century, was a time of remarkable social, economic, and political transformations. This era saw the rise of feudalism in Europe, the flourishing of Islamic caliphates, and the establishment of extensive global trade networks that connected distant parts of the world. Though often viewed as a time of stagnation in the West, the Middle Ages were in fact a period of significant cultural, technological, and intellectual development, particularly in the East and within the Islamic world. The concept of feudalism emerged as a response to the decline of centralized authority in Europe following the fall of the Roman Empire. In the absence of a strong, unified government, political power became decentralized, with local lords controlling land and resources. In return for protection, peasants or serfs worked the land for their lords. The social hierarchy that resulted was rigid, with the monarch at the top, followed by the nobility, clergy, and peasants. Despite its inequities, feudalism helped maintain stability in an otherwise fragmented and often violent Europe. Local economies were largely agrarian, and the Catholic Church played a central role in shaping daily life, both spiritually and politically. In the Middle East, the rise of Islam in the 7th century CE, under the leadership of Prophet Muhammad, rapidly transformed the political and cultural landscape. The spread of Islam was both military and intellectual, uniting vast regions under the banner of the caliphates, particularly the Umayyad and Abbasid dynasties. The Islamic caliphates fostered a golden age of cultural, scientific, and economic advancement, preserving and building upon the knowledge of ancient Greece, Rome, Persia, and India. Cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba became cultural hubs where scholars translated Greek and Roman texts into Arabic, made advancements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering, and laid the foundation for the Renaissance. During this period, the Islamic world became a nexus for trade and intellectual exchange between the East and West. The Silk Road, the ancient trade route connecting China, India, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean, continued to thrive, carrying goods such as silk, spices, and precious metals. Arab merchants, using the innovations of the Islamic Golden Age, created vast trade networks that connected the Middle East to Europe, Africa, and Asia. The expansion of trade routes led to the growth of markets, banks, and trade cities. The Crusades, which began in the 11th century, although primarily military campaigns, also acted as a conduit for cultural and economic exchange between the Christian West and the Muslim East, bringing new ideas, technologies, and products to Europe. The Mongol Empire, one of the largest empires in history, emerged in the 13th century under the leadership of Genghis Khan. The Mongols conquered vast territories across Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, and their empire facilitated a level of global connectivity that was unprecedented for the time. While their invasions were often violent, the Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace, that followed allowed for the free flow of goods, ideas, and technologies across the empire. The Mongols revived the Silk Road, ensuring safe passage for traders and allowing Europe to access valuable goods like silk, tea, and porcelain from China. At the same time, the Mongols' military innovations, such as the use of gunpowder, had lasting impacts on the development of warfare across the world. In Africa, the kingdoms of Ghana, Mali and Songhai became powerful states that controlled important trade routes and accumulated wealth through the exchange of gold, salt, and other resources. The legendary wealth of King Mansa Musa of Mali, for example, is said to have been so vast that it created significant economic disruption when he made a famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, distributing gold along the way. These African empires were also key players in the trans-Saharan trade networks, facilitating cultural exchanges and the spread of Islam across West Africa. Global trade during the Middle Ages also saw the growth of maritime trade routes. The Indian Ocean, connecting East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, India, and Southeast Asia, became a vital trade zone. The Swahili coast, for example, was a center for trade between Africa and the Islamic world, with cities like Kilwa and Mogadishu flourishing as ports of trade. The spread of Islam in this region helped to create cultural links between East Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, further strengthening these maritime trade routes. Similarly, Southeast Asia and China were connected by sea routes that facilitated the exchange of porcelain, spices, silk, and other commodities. In Europe, trade and cultural exchange were initially more limited due to the dominance of feudal structures and frequent warfare. However, by the 12th and 13th centuries, the development of more advanced agricultural techniques, improved navigation, and the establishment of trade fairs and markets helped lay the foundation for the growth of towns and cities. The rise of guilds and merchant classes created a more dynamic economy, leading to the growth of a burgeoning middle class. This period also saw the establishment of the first universities, particularly in Italy and France, which helped to preserve knowledge and foster intellectual life. The Mongol and Islamic empires played a pivotal role in connecting these different regions, creating a vast and interconnected world economy long before the modern era. Cultural exchange was facilitated through the movement of people, ideas, and technologies, and this dynamic environment set the stage for further innovations and discoveries in the centuries to come. While the Middle Ages may have been a period of relative political fragmentation in Europe, the exchanges between empires and regions across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East were instrumental in shaping the future course of world history. Thus, the Middle Ages, while often depicted as an era of relative stagnation in the West, was a period of global connectivity, trade, and cultural exchange that shaped the foundations of the modern world. These interactions not only influenced the political and economic structures of the time, but also contributed to the intellectual, artistic, and technological advancements that would eventually lead to the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. The Middle Ages were far from a dark age. They were a time of interconnectedness that laid the groundwork for the globalization of ideas, goods, and cultures. The Renaissance and the Reformation were two pivotal movements in European history that reshaped the cultural, intellectual, religious, and political landscape of the Western world. Spanning roughly from the 14th to the 17th centuries, these movements marked a dramatic shift away from medieval traditions and laid the foundations for the modern era. The Renaissance was a cultural and intellectual awakening that revived the ideas and aesthetics of classical antiquity, while the Reformation was a religious upheaval that challenged the authority of the Catholic Church and led to the creation of Protestantism. Together, they not only transformed Europe but also had lasting effects on the world. The Renaissance, meaning rebirth in French, was an era of renewed interest in the classical art, literature, and philosophies of ancient Greece and Rome. This intellectual revival began in Italy during the 14th century and spread across Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. The movement was characterized by a focus on humanism, a philosophy that emphasized the value and agency of the individual. Humanist scholars turned to ancient texts, seeking to recover the knowledge of the Greeks and Romans. They were particularly interested in classical literature, rhetoric, and philosophy, and believed that a return to these classical ideals would lead to a more enlightened society. One of the defining features of the Renaissance was the flourishing of the arts. Figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Donatello revolutionized art, creating masterpieces that explored human anatomy, perspective, and the beauty of the natural world. The invention of linear perspective allowed artists to create more realistic depictions of space and depth, while the use of light and shadow gave paintings a greater sense of three-dimensionality. The Renaissance also saw the development of new artistic techniques, including oil painting, which became popular in Northern Europe. The work of Renaissance artists had a profound influence on Western art, setting standards for beauty, realism, and expression that would endure for centuries. At the same time, the Renaissance was a period of significant advancements in science, mathematics, and exploration. Figures like Nicholas Copernicus, Galileo Galilei, and Johannes Kepler challenged traditional views of the universe, laying the groundwork for the scientific revolution. Copernicus' heliocentric theory, which proposed that the Earth and other planets revolve around the Sun, revolutionized humanity's understanding of the cosmos. Galileo, using a telescope, made astronomical observations that supported Copernicus' theory, and Kepler developed laws of planetary motion. These scientific breakthroughs not only reshaped our understanding of the universe, but also paved the way for future advancements in physics and astronomy. The Renaissance also saw the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440. This invention had a profound impact on the spread of knowledge. By making books more affordable and accessible, the printing press allowed for the rapid dissemination of ideas across Europe. The Bible, in particular, was printed in vernacular languages, making it more accessible to the general public and challenging the Church's control over religious knowledge. The spread of printed materials played a key role in the spread of Renaissance ideas and the rise of literacy rates across Europe. While the Renaissance was a period of intellectual, cultural, and artistic flourishing, it also set the stage for the Reformation, a religious and political movement that sought to reform the Catholic Church and ultimately led to the creation of Protestantism. The Reformation began in the early 16th century, when Martin Luther, a German monk, posted his 95 Theses on the door of a church in Wittenberg in 1517. Luther's main grievance was the church's sale of indulgences, a practice in which people could buy forgiveness for their sins. Luther argued that salvation could not be purchased and that it was only through faith in God and grace that one could achieve salvation. His criticism of the Catholic Church resonated with many people who were disillusioned with the Church's corruption, particularly its wealth and political power. Luther's ideas quickly spread, aided by the printing press, and sparked a wave of religious reform across Europe. His teachings emphasized the authority of Scripture over the authority of the Church, arguing that the Bible should be accessible to everyone, not just the clergy. Luther translated the Bible into German, making it available to a wider audience and allowing people to read and interpret Scripture for themselves. His call for reforms, including the rejection of the Catholic Church's hierarchical structure, led to the establishment of various Protestant denominations, such as Lutheranism and Calvinism. The Reformation also led to significant political and social upheaval. In many cases, rulers and states adopted Protestantism in opposition to the power of the Catholic Church and the Pope. In England, for example, King Henry VIII broke with the Catholic Church in the 1530s, establishing the Church of England after the Pope refused to annul his marriage. This move not only had religious implications, but also political ones, as it strengthened the power of the English monarchy over religious affairs. The Reformation also spurred the Catholic Church to reform from within. The Catholic Counter-Reformation, initiated by the Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, sought to address many of the criticisms raised by Protestant reformers. The Church reaffirmed its authority and doctrines, including the importance of tradition and the role of the clergy, while also addressing issues such as corruption and the sale of indulgences. The Counter-Reformation led to a revitalization of Catholicism, particularly in regions like Spain, Italy, and France, and played a significant role in shaping the religious landscape of Europe for centuries to come. Together, the Renaissance and the Reformation were transformative movements that not only reshaped Europe, but also had a lasting global impact. The intellectual and artistic achievements of the Renaissance laid the foundation for the modern world, fostering a renewed interest in science, exploration, and human potential. The Reformation, meanwhile, redefined religious and political authority, giving rise to new religious movements and shaping the course of European history for centuries. These two movements helped to usher in the early modern period, laying the groundwork for the Enlightenment, the rise of nation-states, and the eventual development of democracy. The Age of Exploration, which spanned from the late 15th century to the early 17th century, marked a period of intense global interaction and expansion that reshaped the world in profound ways. Fueled by advancements in navigation, a desire for wealth, and a drive to spread Christianity, European powers embarked on voyages of discovery that ultimately led to the creation of vast empires across the globe. These explorations not only changed the geography of the world, but also had lasting economic, cultural, and political impacts. The effects of this era are still felt today, as it played a key role in the development of modern global trade, colonialism, and the interconnectedness of world societies. One of the primary motivations behind European exploration was the pursuit of new trade routes to the East. The medieval trade routes, particularly those through the Middle East, were controlled by Islamic empires, and Europeans were eager to find direct access to the riches of Asia, particularly spices, silk, and other valuable goods. The Ottoman Empire's control of key trading routes in the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean made these goods expensive and difficult to access for European merchants. European nations sought alternative routes to India and China, which led to the opening of sea-based trade routes. The Portuguese were pioneers in the Age of Exploration, with Prince Henry the Navigator playing a crucial role in the early stages of the Maritime Revolution. Under his patronage, Portuguese explorers began charting the coast of Africa, seeking a sea route to India. In 1488, Bartolomé Dias successfully rounded the southern tip of Africa, opening up the possibility of a sea route to the Indian Ocean. This achievement paved the way for Vasco da Gama's voyage to India in 1498, which was one of the most significant milestones of the Age of Exploration. Da Gama's journey around Africa to reach India established Portugal as a dominant colonial power in Asia, setting up trading posts and colonies along the African and Indian coasts. Meanwhile, Spain, another maritime power, was also seeking to find new trade routes to the east. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, sponsored by Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain, embarked on a journey to find a westward route to Asia. Instead of reaching Asia, Columbus landed in the Caribbean, opening up the new world for European exploration. His voyages are often credited with opening the Americas to European colonization, though Columbus himself believed he had found islands off the coast of Asia. The Spanish Empire quickly began to establish colonies in the Americas, and over the next century, Spain would build an empire that spanned vast regions of North, Central, and South America. Conquistadors such as Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro led expeditions that resulted in the downfall of the powerful Aztec and Inca civilizations, bringing enormous wealth to Spain through the plunder of gold, silver, and other resources. The Spanish Empire became the richest in Europe, and Spain's dominance in the Americas was further solidified through the establishment of the encomienda system, a labor system that exploited indigenous peoples for agricultural and mining work. The Portuguese, too, established colonies in the Americas, most notably Brazil, which became a major source of sugar production. The Portuguese also set up extensive trading networks in Africa, where they became heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade, bringing enslaved Africans to work on plantations in the Americas. The Portuguese influence extended to parts of Asia, where they established trading posts in India, China, and Southeast Asia, contributing to the growth of a global economy based on colonial resources. As European powers like Spain and Portugal expanded their empires, other nations, including England, France, and the Netherlands, began to join the race for overseas territories. The English, after a failed early attempt to establish a colony in the Americas, ultimately succeeded with the founding of Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. This marked the beginning of British colonization in North America, which would grow into a vast empire with colonies throughout the Americas, the Caribbean, and later in Asia and Africa. The French, too, established colonies in the Americas, most notably in Canada, New France, and the Caribbean. French explorers such as Jacques Cartier and Samuel de Champlain navigated the St. Lawrence River and founded the first permanent French settlement in North America. France's colonies in the Americas became major centers of fur trading, while the French also established a strong presence in the Caribbean, particularly in Haiti, which became one of the wealthiest colonies in the world due to sugar and slave labor. The Dutch, with their maritime prowess, also established a formidable presence during the Age of Exploration. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, became a powerful commercial enterprise, controlling trade routes and establishing colonies in Asia. The Dutch West India Company focused on the Americas, where they established colonies in the Caribbean and along the Atlantic coast of North America, most notably in New Amsterdam, which would later become New York. The process of colonization, however, was not without its consequences. Indigenous populations across the Americas, Africa, and Asia were decimated by diseases brought by Europeans, particularly smallpox. In the Americas, the introduction of European diseases, along with warfare, forced labor, and displacement, caused the death of millions of indigenous people, drastically reducing their populations and altering the cultural landscape of the continent. The introduction of new animals, plants, and crops, such as horses, cattle, wheat, and sugar, also transformed the environments of the Americas and other colonized regions, contributing to ecological changes that were often destructive to native ecosystems. The economic model of colonization, driven by the need for labor-intensive agriculture and mining, led to the establishment of the transatlantic slave trade. European nations relied on the forced labor of enslaved Africans to work in the colonies, particularly in the Caribbean and the Americas. The triangular trade system saw slaves captured in Africa, often through violent raids and warfare, transported across the Atlantic to work on plantations and in mines. In exchange, European traders provided firearms, textiles, and other goods to African kingdoms. This brutal system of slavery not only devastated African societies, but also fueled the growth of European colonial empires and the global economy. The Age of Exploration and Colonization also led to the exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices between different parts of the world. The Columbian Exchange, as this transfer is known, saw the movement of crops, animals, and even diseases between the Old World, Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the New World, the Americas. Crops like potatoes, maize, and tomatoes were introduced to Europe, while wheat, rice, and sugarcane were brought to the Americas. The exchange had profound impacts on diets, agriculture, and economies across the globe, though it also contributed to the exploitation and destruction of native cultures. In conclusion, the Age of Exploration and Colonization was a period of immense change that reshaped the world in lasting ways. European explorers and colonizers, motivated by the quest for wealth, religious expansion, and political power, opened up new trade routes, established global empires, and forever altered the course of history. The legacy of this era is complex. While it brought new technologies, ideas, and cultural exchanges, it also resulted in exploitation, environmental destruction, and the suffering of millions. The interconnected world that emerged from this period laid the foundation for the globalized society we live in today. The scientific revolution and the Enlightenment were two closely related intellectual movements that transformed human understanding of the natural world, society, and government, laying the groundwork for the modern age. Spanning roughly from the 16th to the 18th centuries, these movements were driven by a quest for knowledge, a challenge to traditional authority, and a belief in the power of reason and empirical evidence to improve human life. The scientific revolution, with its focus on observation, experimentation, and the scientific method, fundamentally reshaped science and philosophy, while the Enlightenment expanded these principles to broader social, political, and cultural realms, advocating for rational thought, individual rights, and the questioning of authority. The roots of the scientific revolution lie in earlier intellectual developments, including the work of medieval scholars who preserved and expanded upon the knowledge of ancient Greek and Roman thinkers. However, it was during the Renaissance that there was a shift in how knowledge was approached. Humanism, with its emphasis on individual inquiry and the rediscovery of classical texts, encouraged a new attitude toward learning and observation. In particular, the work of Renaissance artists and engineers, such as Leonardo da Vinci, led to a growing interest in anatomy, mechanics, and the natural world. The key turning point in the scientific revolution came with the work of Nicholas Copernicus, whose heliocentric theory, published in 1543, challenged the long-held Ptolemaic view that the Earth was the center of the universe. Copernicus proposed that the Earth and the other planets revolved around the Sun, a theory that fundamentally altered the way humanity viewed its place in the cosmos. Although initially controversial, Copernicus' ideas were supported by later astronomers, such as Johannes Kepler, who discovered that the planets followed elliptical orbits, and Galileo Galilei, whose observations with a telescope provided crucial evidence in support of the heliocentric model. Galileo's discoveries, such as the moons of Jupiter and the phases of Venus, directly contradicted the geocentric view of the universe, leading to conflict with the Catholic Church, which held that the Earth was the center of God's creation. Another pivotal figure in the scientific revolution was Isaac Newton, whose work in the late 17th century culminated in the formulation of the laws of motion and universal gravitation. Newton's Principia Mathematica, 1687, provided a comprehensive framework for understanding the physical universe. His mathematical approach to physics established the foundations for classical mechanics, which would dominate scientific thought for centuries. Newton's work unified the physical laws governing both celestial and terrestrial bodies, emphasizing that the universe operated according to predictable, discoverable laws. His contributions helped shift the focus of science away from theological explanations of the natural world toward empirical observation and reasoned experimentation. The impact of the scientific revolution was far-reaching, extending beyond the field of astronomy and physics to chemistry, biology, and medicine. Figures such as Andreas Vesalius, who advanced the study of human anatomy, and William Harvey, who discovered the circulation of blood, contributed to a revolution in the life sciences. In chemistry, Robert Boyle is often considered the father of modern chemistry for his development of the scientific method in experimentation and his formulation of Boyle's law, which describes the relationship between the pressure and volume of gas. As the scientific revolution progressed, it laid the intellectual foundations for the Enlightenment, a cultural and intellectual movement that emphasized reason, individualism, and skepticism of authority. Enlightenment thinkers, known as philosophes, believed that human beings were capable of using reason to improve their lives and society. They championed the idea of progress and the power of human intellect to bring about social, political, and economic reforms. Central to Enlightenment thought was the belief that knowledge should be accessible to all and that individuals had the right to think for themselves, free from the constraints of tradition, superstition, and religious dogma. One of the most influential figures of the Enlightenment was René Descartes, who is often credited with establishing the philosophical foundations of modern science. Descartes' emphasis on doubt and inquiry led him to formulate his famous dictum, cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, which became the starting point for his philosophy of knowledge. Descartes believed that reason was the path to true knowledge and that the natural world could be understood through rational thought. His work in mathematics and philosophy greatly influenced later Enlightenment thinkers and the development of modern scientific methodology. Another key Enlightenment figure was John Locke, whose ideas on government and individual rights would have a profound impact on the development of liberal political theory. Locke argued that individuals had natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that government should be formed to protect these rights. He rejected the idea of absolute monarchy, instead advocating for a government based on the consent of the governed. His ideas were foundational to the development of modern democracy and influenced revolutions in both America and France in the 18th century. The French philosopher Voltaire was another leading figure of the Enlightenment. Voltaire's writings attacked religious intolerance, dogma, and the absolute power of the monarchy. He was a strong proponent of freedom of speech, the separation of church and state, and the idea of progress through reason. His works, such as Candide, satirized the societal and political injustices of his time, and his advocacy for civil liberties made him a central figure in the development of modern liberal thought. The French political philosopher Montesquieu made significant contributions to political theory with his work The Spirit of the Laws, 1748, in which he analyzed the principles of government and argued for the separation of powers into three branches: the executive, legislative, and judiciary. This idea of the separation of powers became a cornerstone of modern constitutional design, influencing the creation of the United States Constitution in 1787. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another influential Enlightenment thinker, focused on the relationship between the individual and society. In his work The Social Contract, 1762, Rousseau argued that legitimate political authority is based on a contract between individuals and the state. He believed that in an ideal society, individuals would come together to form a general will, a collective will that represents the common good. Rousseau's ideas about democracy and the sovereignty of the people influenced revolutionary movements, especially during the French Revolution. The Enlightenment also saw the rise of the public sphere, as coffeehouses, salons, and pamphlets became popular venues for the exchange of ideas. The printing press, which had already played a key role in the spread of scientific knowledge during the Scientific Revolution, became even more central during the Enlightenment, as ideas were rapidly disseminated across Europe. This growing exchange of ideas contributed to the gradual erosion of absolute monarchy and the spread of democratic ideals. The impact of the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment on society was profound. The focus on reason and empirical evidence encouraged a shift away from superstition, religious dogma, and traditional hierarchies. The ideas of the Enlightenment, which emphasized liberty, equality, and fraternity, became the foundation for revolutionary movements, including the American Revolution, 1776, and the French Revolution, 1789. These revolutions, in turn, promoted the establishment of republics based on democratic principles, the rule of law, and the protection of individual rights. In conclusion, the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment represented transformative shifts in human thought that forever altered the course of history. By challenging old beliefs and advocating for reason, progress, and individual rights, these movements laid the foundations for the modern scientific world, the development of democracy, and the spread of human rights across the globe. The Enlightenment, in particular, played a central role in the creation of modern Western political systems, and its legacy continues to shape the way societies understand knowledge, governance, and individual freedoms today. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century in Great Britain and spread to other parts of the world, was a period of profound economic, social, and technological transformation that fundamentally altered the course of human history. This revolution marked the shift from agrarian economies based on manual labor and handicrafts to industrialized economies dominated by machines, factories, and mass production. The profound changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution reshaped society, created new industries, transformed the nature of work, and paved the way for the modern world as we know it today. One of the key factors that contributed to the Industrial Revolution was the availability of natural resources, particularly coal and iron. Coal, which was abundant in Britain, became a primary source of energy for the new steam engines and other industrial machinery. Iron, essential for building machines, infrastructure, and tools, was also readily available. These natural resources provided the necessary raw materials to fuel industrial growth, particularly in industries like textiles, coal mining, and transportation. The development of new technologies played a critical role in accelerating the Industrial Revolution. One of the most important inventions was the steam engine, which revolutionized industry and transportation. The early steam engine, developed by Thomas Newcomen, was later improved by James Watt in the 1770s. Watt's improvements made steam engines more efficient, allowing them to be used in a wide range of industries, including coal mining, textiles, and manufacturing. Steam power also played a central role in the development of railways and steamships, transforming transportation and enabling goods and people to move more quickly and efficiently than ever before. The textile industry was one of the first sectors to experience significant change during the Industrial Revolution. Prior to this period, the production of textiles was a labor-intensive process done by hand in small workshops or at home. However, with the invention of machines like the spinning jenny, the water frame, and the power loom, the production of textiles became more efficient and centralized in factories. These machines greatly increased productivity, allowing for the mass production of cloth and other textiles. The mechanization of textile production, along with the growth of factories, also led to the rise of factory-based labor systems, which required workers to operate the machines in centralized locations. The rise of factories had a transformative impact on the workforce and urbanization. With the growth of factory production, workers were increasingly drawn to urban areas where these factories were located. Cities like Manchester, Liverpool, and Birmingham in Britain experienced rapid population growth as people from rural areas migrated to the cities in search of work. This process of urbanization led to the development of new social structures, as urban centers became hubs of industrial activity. However, this urbanization also created significant social challenges, including overcrowding, poor living conditions, inadequate sanitation, and the spread of disease. The rapid growth of cities and the concentration of factories in urban areas also led to the rise of a new working class, whose labor fueled the industrial economy. The Industrial Revolution also brought about significant changes in the nature of work. The rise of factory-based production systems led to the creation of a new factory labor force, which was often subject to long hours, low wages, and dangerous working conditions. Workers, including children, were required to operate heavy machinery in poorly ventilated and often hazardous environments. In the early years of industrialization, labor laws were minimal, and the working conditions in factories were harsh. The rapid pace of work, along with the use of machines that could be dangerous if improperly operated, led to injuries and deaths among workers. This exploitation of labor, especially child labor, became one of the major issues addressed by social reformers in the 19th century. The development of transportation networks, particularly railroads, was another hallmark of the Industrial Revolution. The expansion of the railway system enabled the faster movement of goods and people, revolutionizing trade and commerce. Railroads facilitated the transportation of raw materials, such as coal and iron, to factories and allowed finished goods to be distributed more widely across regions and even countries. The steam engine-powered locomotive, first developed by George Stephenson in the early 19th century, was the key technology behind this transportation revolution. The widespread construction of railroads helped to integrate national economies, enabling industries to thrive and facilitating the rise of consumer markets. Alongside railroads, the development of steamships also played a significant role in transforming transportation during the Industrial Revolution. Steamships, which were powered by steam engines, were faster and more reliable than traditional sailing ships, allowing for quicker and more efficient trade across oceans. This revolutionized global trade, enabling countries to engage in international commerce on a scale never before seen. It also contributed to the growth of the global economy, as goods could now be transported more efficiently between continents. The Industrial Revolution was also accompanied by significant advancements in other areas, such as agriculture, communication, and technology. In agriculture, the introduction of new farming techniques and tools, such as the mechanical reaper and the seed drill, allowed for increased productivity on farms. These innovations, coupled with improvements in irrigation and crop rotation, helped to support the growing urban populations by producing more food. The increased availability of food, along with the growth of cities, led to further demographic changes, including an increase in life expectancy and a reduction in famines. In communication, the development of the telegraph by Samuel Morse in the 1830s revolutionized long-distance communication. The telegraph allowed messages to be sent almost instantaneously across vast distances, which had a profound impact on business, journalism, and even international relations. The ability to communicate quickly and efficiently helped to facilitate the growth of global trade and connected people in ways that were previously unimaginable. The impact of the Industrial Revolution on society was not just economic, but also political and cultural. The rise of industrial capitalism led to the growth of powerful industrialists and entrepreneurs, while simultaneously creating a large working class. This shift in social and economic structures prompted debates about the distribution of wealth and power. Critics of industrial capitalism, such as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, argued that the exploitation of workers and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few industrialists would lead to social unrest and class conflict. Marx's ideas on class struggle and the need for a workers' revolution would later play a central role in the development of socialist and communist movements. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution also had a profound impact on culture. The The rise of mass production and consumer goods led to the growth of a consumer society, where people could purchase products that were once considered luxury items. The increased availability of goods, coupled with improvements in transportation and communication, helped to create a more interconnected world. The Industrial Revolution also contributed to the growth of education, as the need for skilled labor led to the establishment of schools and universities, which helped to provide workers with the knowledge and skills necessary to work in industrial settings. The spread of industrialization to other parts of the world, particularly to Europe, the United States, and later Japan, contributed to the development of global trade networks and the spread of Western technologies. The effects of industrialization, however, were not uniform. While some countries embraced industrialization and reaped the benefits of economic growth, others, particularly in Africa and Asia, were left behind, often becoming subjects of colonial exploitation as European powers sought raw materials and markets for their industrial products. In conclusion, the Industrial Revolution was a defining period in human history that brought about sweeping changes in almost every aspect of life. From the growth of factories and the rise of new technologies to the transformation of transportation and communication, the Industrial Revolution reshaped economies, societies, and cultures across the globe. The legacy of the Industrial Revolution is still evident today, as the innovations and social changes it brought about continue to influence the world in profound ways. The transformation of labor, the rise of capitalism, and the growth of consumer societies all have their roots in this pivotal era of history. The World Wars, World War I and World War II, were among the most defining events in modern history, shaping the course of the 20th century and leaving an indelible impact on global politics, society, and economics. These wars were characterized by widespread violence, the mobilization of entire societies, and unprecedented levels of destruction. The consequences of these conflicts reshaped borders, ideologies, and the balance of power across the globe, influencing everything from the emergence of new political systems to the development of global institutions. The first half of the 20th century, particularly the two world wars, would set the stage for much of the geopolitical landscape that we see today. World War I, 1914 to 1918. World War I, also known as the Great War, was the first major conflict of the 20th century, involving many of the world's great powers. The war was triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in June 1914, but it was the result of much deeper political, economic, and military tensions that had been brewing for decades. The war was fought between two primary alliances: the Allies, including France, the United Kingdom, Russia, and later the United States, and the Central Powers, led by Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The causes of World War I were multifaceted, rooted in nationalism, militarism, imperialism, and complex alliances between European powers. Nationalism, the belief in the superiority of one's nation over others, contributed to a sense of competition between European powers, especially in the Balkans. Militarism, the belief in building up strong military forces to resolve international disputes, led to an arms race in Europe. Imperialism, the quest for colonies and resources around the world, further exacerbated tensions as nations sought to expand their empires. The alliance system, where nations formed mutual defense pacts, turned what could have been a localized conflict into a world war. The war was characterized by trench warfare, a brutal and grueling form of combat that defined the Western Front. Soldiers lived in cramped, unsanitary conditions, often enduring constant bombardment, disease, and death. On the Eastern Front, the war was more fluid, with massive battles fought across vast distances. The war saw the use of new technologies, including tanks, machine guns, and poison gas, which changed the nature of warfare. The death toll was staggering, with an estimated 10 million military deaths and an even greater number of civilian casualties. The war ended in 1918 with an armistice, but it left Europe in ruins and caused profound political and social upheaval. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended the war but placed much of the blame on Germany, imposing harsh reparations and territorial losses. The treaty's punitive terms sowed resentment in Germany, which contributed to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the conditions that led to World War II. The war also led to the collapse of several empires. The Austro-Hungarian, Russian, German, and Ottoman empires all disintegrated, leading to the creation of new nation-states in Europe and the Middle East. The interwar period, 1919 to 1939. In the aftermath of World War I, the global political order was drastically altered. The League of Nations was established in an effort to prevent future conflicts, but it was largely ineffective due to the absence of key powers like the United States and the reluctance of many nations to support it fully. The Treaty of Versailles, rather than fostering lasting peace, created a sense of humiliation and bitterness, especially in Germany, where the economic burden of reparations and territorial losses contributed to widespread discontent. The interwar period was marked by the rise of totalitarian regimes, particularly in Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union. In Germany, the harsh conditions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles and the economic instability caused by hyperinflation and the Great Depression created fertile ground for the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Hitler's aggressive expansionist policies and his belief in the superiority of the Aryan race led to the rearmament of Germany and the eventual invasion of neighboring countries, setting the stage for World War II. In Italy, Benito Mussolini established a fascist regime in 1922, promoting nationalism, authoritarian rule, and expansionism. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, became a totalitarian state that sought to spread communism through repression, forced collectivization, and the purging of political enemies. The rise of these regimes created a climate of political instability and tension that eventually erupted into the most destructive conflict the world had ever seen. World War II, 1939 to 1945. World War II was the deadliest and most widespread conflict in history, involving over 100 million people from more than 30 countries. It began in 1939 when Germany, under Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland, prompting Britain and France to declare war on Germany. The war quickly spread across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, involving battles on multiple fronts and with numerous countries becoming embroiled in the conflict. The main Axis powers were Germany, Italy, and Japan, while the Allies consisted of the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and China, among others. The war was fought on two primary fronts, the European Front and the Pacific Front. In Europe, Germany's blitzkrieg tactics initially overwhelmed countries like France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The Battle of Britain in 1940 marked a turning point, as the British Royal Air Force successfully defended the United Kingdom against a German aerial assault. In the Soviet Union, the Germans advanced deep into Soviet territory, but the harsh winter and determined Soviet resistance at key battles, such as the Battle of Stalingrad, began to turn the tide in favor of the Allies. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japan sought to expand its empire across East Asia and the Pacific, attacking Pearl Harbor in 1941 and drawing the United States into the war. The United States, after a series of brutal island-hopping campaigns, eventually brought the war in the Pacific to a close with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. World War II also saw horrific atrocities, including the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, were systematically murdered by the Nazi regime. The war's brutality and the extent of the genocide committed by the Axis powers shocked the world and led to efforts to prevent such atrocities in the future. In the aftermath of the war, the United Nations was established to promote peace, human rights, and cooperation among nations, though the deep ideological divides between the Soviet Union and the United States would soon lead to the Cold War. The war ended in 1945 with the unconditional surrender of Germany in May and Japan in September. The consequences of World War II were far-reaching, reshaping the global political landscape. Europe was devastated, and large parts of Asia and Africa were affected by the conflict. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, dominating global politics in the years to come. The war also led to the decolonization of Africa and Asia, as former colonial powers were weakened and new nations sought independence. The legacy of the World Wars. The World Wars had a profound impact on the political, social, and economic order of the 20th century. The wars led to the downfall of imperial systems and the emergence of new nation-states. They also contributed to the development of international institutions, such as the United Nations, designed to promote diplomacy, peace, and cooperation to prevent future global conflicts. The wars also played a significant role in shaping the modern global economy, with the United States and the Soviet Union emerging as the two dominant superpowers, setting the stage for the Cold War. The World Wars also left deep scars on the global psyche. The unprecedented scale of death and destruction, the widespread suffering caused by combat, genocide, and war crimes, and the lingering effects of post-war economic and social dislocation have left lasting legacies in the collective memory of the world. The wars also changed the nature of warfare itself, introducing new technologies, strategies, and weapons that would continue to evolve in the post-war era. In many ways, the World Wars marked the end of the traditional European-dominated global order and the beginning of a new, more interconnected world where the United States and the Soviet Union would vie for global influence, shaping the political and cultural climate of the Cold War period that followed. The consequences of the World Wars are still felt today, in the form of ongoing geopolitical tensions, the establishment of international organizations aimed at peacekeeping, and the continuing pursuit of justice for war crimes and human rights abuses committed during the wars. The Cold War, a period of intense political and military tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, spanned nearly 5 decades, from the end of World War II in 1945 until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Unlike the two world wars, the Cold War was primarily a war of ideologies, capitalism versus communism, rather than direct military conflict between the superpowers. However, the competition between these two ideological camps shaped global politics, economics, and military strategies throughout much of the 20th century, leading to a number of proxy wars, arms races, and confrontations that brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation on more than one occasion. The Cold War was rooted in the aftermath of World War II, where the world was divided into two spheres of influence, one controlled by the capitalist United States and its Western allies, and the other by the communist Soviet Union and its satellite states in Eastern Europe. The stark contrast between the democratic, free market economies of the West and the authoritarian, centrally planned economies of the East fueled a deep ideological divide that became the defining feature of global politics for much of the 20th century. The emergence of two superpowers. After the defeat of Nazi Germany in 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two dominant superpowers, each vying for global influence. The United States, having largely been spared the devastation of war on its own soil, emerged with unparalleled economic and military power. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was victorious in defeating Nazi Germany, but suffered tremendous losses, including the deaths of millions of soldiers and civilians. Despite these losses, the Soviet Union's control over Eastern Europe and its expanding influence in Asia placed it in direct opposition to the United States and its allies. In the early years of the Cold War, both superpowers sought to expand their influence through a variety of means, including diplomacy, military alliances, economic aid, and covert operations. The U.S. adopted a policy of containment, aimed at preventing the spread of communism to other parts of the world. This was famously articulated in the Truman Doctrine of 1947, which pledged American support to countries threatened by communism. At the same time, the Marshall Plan provided economic aid to Western European countries to help them rebuild after the war, thereby strengthening their economies and reducing the appeal of communism. In response, the Soviet Union sought to expand its sphere of influence through the establishment of communist regimes in Eastern Europe and by supporting communist movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The Warsaw Pact, formed in 1955, was a military alliance of communist states in Eastern Europe, established as a counter to NATO, which had been formed in 1949 to provide collective defense for the capitalist nations of Europe and North America. The Cold War was thus defined by this bipolar world order, where global power was concentrated in the hands of two competing superpowers, the arms race and the threat of nuclear war. One of the defining features of the Cold War was the arms race, particularly the nuclear arms race, between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations developed and stockpiled vast arsenals of nuclear weapons, leading to a terrifying new reality: the potential for global annihilation. The development of the atomic bomb by the United States in 1945 and the subsequent Soviet development of its own nuclear weapons in 1949 created a standoff between the two superpowers that would define much of the Cold War. The concept of mutually assured destruction, MAD, became a cornerstone of Cold War military strategy. Both the United States and the Soviet Union understood that if either side launched a nuclear attack, the other would retaliate, leading to the complete destruction of both countries and potentially the world. This paradoxical situation, in which both sides had the capability to destroy each other, served as a deterrent against direct military conflict. However, the threat of nuclear war was ever present, and moments of intense crisis, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, brought the world to the brink of disaster. During the Cold War, both superpowers developed and tested increasingly sophisticated nuclear weapons, including intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, nuclear submarines, and hydrogen bombs. The arms race was not only a military competition, but also a symbolic contest, with both sides seeking to demonstrate their technological superiority. The space race, for example, was closely tied to the arms race, as both nations sought to prove their technological prowess by sending the first satellites and humans into space. The Soviet Union's launch of Sputnik in 1957 marked the beginning of the space race, and the United States responded by landing a man on the moon in 1969. Proxy wars and global conflict. While the Cold War was defined by a lack of direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, it was characterized by numerous proxy wars and conflicts in various parts of the world. These were wars in which the superpowers supported opposing sides, often through military aid, economic assistance, or covert operations. The most significant proxy wars occurred in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where the ideological struggle between communism and capitalism played out on the ground. One of the earliest and most significant proxy wars of the Cold War was the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. Following the division of Korea into Communist North Korea and capitalist South Korea after World War II, the North, backed by the Soviet Union and China, invaded the South, prompting military intervention by the United States and its allies under the auspices of the United Nations. The war ended in an armistice, with Korea remaining divided along the 38th parallel, a situation that still exists today. Another major conflict was the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, in which the United States intervened to support the South Vietnamese government against the Communist North, which was backed by the Soviet Union and China. The war was highly controversial and ultimately ended in the fall of Saigon in 1975 with the unification of Vietnam under communist rule. The Vietnam War, along with other proxy wars such as those in Afghanistan and Angola, highlighted the brutal and often devastating consequences of Cold War competition, as local populations were caught in the crossfire of superpower rivalry. The Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War occurred in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of the United States, in response to the U.S. placing missiles in Turkey. The discovery of these Soviet missiles by U.S. reconnaissance planes led to a tense standoff between the two superpowers, with both sides on high alert for nuclear war. For 13 days, the world held its breath as President John F. Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev engaged in intense negotiations, with both sides preparing for the possibility of nuclear conflict. Ultimately, a diplomatic resolution was reached, with the Soviet Union agreeing to remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis is often seen as the closest the world came to nuclear war during the Cold War and served as a wake-up call for both superpowers about the dangers of their nuclear arsenals. Détente and the end of the Cold War. In the 1970s, the Cold War entered a phase known as détente, a period of reduced tensions and improved relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. Détente was characterized by arms control agreements, such as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which aimed to limit the number of nuclear weapons and reduce the risk of nuclear war. The 1970s also saw increased diplomatic exchanges, including the historic meeting between U.S. President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev in 1972, which marked a thaw in relations. However, the 1980s saw a resurgence of Cold War tensions, particularly under the leadership of U.S. President Ronald Reagan, who took a hardline stance against the Soviet Union. Reagan's administration increased military spending and pursued policies aimed at weakening the Soviet economy, including the Strategic Defense Initiative (SDI), a proposed missile defense system. The Soviet Union, under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, also faced significant internal challenges, including economic stagnation, political reform movements, and rising public dissatisfaction with the government. The end of the Cold War was marked by a series of significant events in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Gorbachev's reforms, including perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, political openness, led to greater political freedoms and a loosening of the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, symbolizing the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union itself dissolved in 1991, marking the definitive end of the Cold War and the emergence of the United States as the sole global superpower. Legacy of the Cold War. The Cold War had a profound impact on the global order and international relations, shaping much of the modern world. The ideological divide between capitalism and communism continues to influence political ideologies and global conflicts today. The Cold War also led to the creation of numerous international organizations, such as the United Nations, and military alliances like NATO, which continue to play significant roles in global governance. The legacy of the Cold War also includes the proliferation of nuclear weapons, which remains a critical issue in international politics. While the Cold War is officially over, the competition for influence between the U.S. and Russia, as well as tensions with other nuclear powers like China and North Korea, demonstrates that the impact of the Cold War continues to shape the global political landscape in the 21st century. In many ways, the Cold War marked the beginning of a new era in global history, in which the ideological and political struggles of the 20th century continue to influence the world's nations and their relationships with each other.